Hey guys, only a few more lectures you'll hear from me this semester. Today we are covering public opinion, and your third quiz is also posted. Don't forget that will be due at midnight. I guess that's technically March 13th at midnight or 11:59 p.m. So you have 1 week to take that, and then at that same time your second exam will get posted. You'll have a week to take that. And your essay prompt will be posted. And don't forget, your essay is due on the final day of class, which is April 25th. And that is all the instructions will be posted for that as well. Your essay is 20% of your grade. Each of your exams is 20% of your grade, and all of your quizzes added up together is 20% of your grade. Let me know if you have any questions. Otherwise, we're going to dig into public opinion. So your textbook starts out talking about the Brexit. In 2016, the United Kingdom had this non-binding but politically important referendum, which is a popular vote, on whether the United Kingdom, which is England, Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales, and Gibraltar, Great Britain, would retain its membership in the European Union, which is an economic and political union of 28 European countries that dated in some form back to the days after World War II. The UK has always been a little bit different from the rest of Europe. They've never adopted the euro as their currency, but they weren't really sure about whether or not they would be part of the EU, if they wanted to be part of it or if they wanted to exit from the European Union. So they held this vote. British exit polls showed that public opinion favored remaining in the European Union. And so David Cameron was the prime minister at the time. He held a vote just to kind of appeal his opponents, but then the Brexit folks won. They had 51.9% of the vote, and Cameron was not expecting this. He ended up resigning. A lot of Brits were expressing misgivings about the way they'd voted. They'd previously kind of been loose with the facts. They've since had, I think, 2 different prime ministers trying to negotiate deals with Europe that would maybe lessen the fallout or perhaps even find a way for the European Union to stay, or the United Kingdom to stay in the European Union after all. So a referenda like this can have an unexpected consequence. Are they a good idea? Letting the people decide is an attractive idea in a country like the United States that prides itself on democracy, but how much responsibility do you want to take for the way you're governed? A lot of us are comfortable with the idea that we should vote for those who make our rules, but how do we feel about voting on the rules themselves? California actually does this pretty often. Do we know enough to vote on laws for the country as a whole? Should we be governed more by public opinion than by the opinion of our elected leaders? It's honestly kind of trendy to denounce public opinion polls. 65% of people say that polls are right only some of the time. But politicians are leery and maybe even a little scornful of polls. But what's so bad about being ruled about the polls in the democracy, which is supposed to be ruled by the people? If politics is supposed to be who gets what and how, shouldn't we care about what the who thinks? Public opinion is the collective attitudes and beliefs of individuals on one or more issues. Public opinion polls are scientific efforts to estimate what these groups think about issues by taking a smaller sample for its opinion. We want to believe that what we think matters, but we'd also like to think that our elected officials are guided by unwavering principles. Public opinion is important in democracy for 2 different reasons: normative and empirical. Normative, we believe public opinion should influence what the government does. Empirical, a lot of people behave as if public opinion does matter, so to the degree that they measure, record, and react to it, it does become a factor in American politics. Why should public opinion matter? Our founding is about the rejection of the aristocracy and the monarchy and the rise of popular sovereignty. The idea that people matter, not the monarchy, right? The presence of the people is pervasive in the documents and narratives that create and support our American government. For example, in the Declaration of Independence, we say the consent of the governed. In the Constitution, we say we the people. In the Gettysburg Address, government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And the very legitimacy of the United States government rests on the idea that the government exists to serve the interests of its citizens. Since our founding, there's been a shift in the greater role for citizenry in politics. The 7th Amendment took the election of the Senate from state legislatures to the citizens of the states. State politics are instruments of direct democracy that allow citizens to vote on policies and how we remove officials from office. How do we determine whose views should be heard? There's different theories of democracy that prescribe different roles for who what the people is, in part because those theories disagree about how competent the citizens of a country are to govern themselves. A lot of elitists say citizens are too ignorant or ill-informed to be trusted with major decisions. And then proponents of a participatory democracy have faith that people are both smart enough and able to gather enough information. But as Americans, we're confused about what the role of a democratic citizen should be. Should it be a virtuous citizen who's concerned with the common good, who recognizes that democracy carries obligations as well as rights? I think a citizen should be attentive to and informed about politics, exhibit political tolerance and willingness to compromise, and practice high levels of participation in civic activities. Or are Americans apolitical, self-interested actors? Americans are almost the opposite of this. We're inattentive, ill-informed, politically intolerant and rigid, and unlikely to get involved in political life. Maybe we're a little bit of both. But public opinion does matter. When Congress votes on a major bill, members of Congress worry a lot about public opinion in their district. The president usually has an in-house paid public opinion expert. The public acts maybe as if they aren't paying attention, but it can act decisively if the provocation is sufficient. For example, in 2006, the midterm elections showed voters were frustrated with the war in Iraq by giving control of the House and Senate to the Democrats. This is probably likely going to happen again this fall. I think I am anticipating we give a lot of power back to the Republicans in the House and the Senate. Horse race polls are kind of, who's ahead. They ask about people's voting intentions, and lend drama to media coverage of electoral races. How do we measure up as citizens? Americans hold two different views on what citizenship is about, but usually we're somewhere in the middle. Some citizens tune out political news but are tolerant of others and vote regularly. A lot of citizens are informed, opinionated, and participatory, but maybe intolerant of others' views, making democratic politics difficult. There's three elements of an ideal citizen. They have political knowledge, tolerance, and they participate. Which of those is most important? The ideal democratic citizen understands how government works, who the actors are, what the principles that underlie the political system are, but Americans are not very well informed about their political system. Knowledge is key for knowing whom to thank or who to blame for government policy. And virtually everyone can tell you who the president is right now, but not many people can name other offices. Who is our Supreme Court Chief Justice right now? It's John Roberts. Is he conservative or liberal? He's conservative. Right now, who controls the House of Representatives? It's the Democrats. You guys are going to know these things because you've taken this class, but a lot of folks maybe don't know these things. So your political knowledge and interest is maybe a little bit higher. What about tolerance? A key demographic is tolerance. People jockey for position and competing visions of common good, tolerance for ideas different than one's own, respect for the rights of others to keep the democratic machinery running smoothly. Tolerance is a prerequisite for compromise, which is an essential part of politics. And then participation. One of the most consistent criticisms of Americans by those concerned with democratic health of the nation is that we don't participate enough, which is usually correct. The voter turnout in the United States ranks almost last among industrialized nations. There are greater levels of participation seen with those with more education and higher income. The elements of an ideal democratic citizen, though, are not distributed equally across the population. There are forces around us that bring most of us to a consensus on the basics of political culture and more complex forces that guide us into adopting more divisive ideologies. Democracies depend on each new generation picking up the values and allegiances of previous generations. The beliefs in the legitimacy of the political system and its leaders, and the willingness to obey the laws and commands of those leaders. The children in France or in China support their leaders just as surely as the children of the United States do. This is called political socialization, the process by which we learn our political orientations and allegiances. They're transferred from generation to generation. We learn patriotism and good citizenship skills early on through things like family and school and church, which all have an interest in turning out a well-behaved child with loyalty to country. But your family is probably your biggest influence on your political development. Kids develop an emotional response to some fundamental objects of government before they really understand much about these objects. They learn that mostly the police are good in most communities, that the president is important, that the flag deserves respect. Patriotism is a strong emotional attachment to one's political community, which develops honestly in the preschool years. I have preschoolers and they have learned their Pledge of Allegiance and are very proud of it. Watching the fireworks on the 4th of July and saying the pledge makes them absorb that being American is something special. Kids tend to be in the same political party as their parents, which is interesting for me because I'm very involved in politics and my parents were not at all. And every time they voted, they would not tell me who they voted for. So I couldn't really identify that for them growing up. But my husband and I have both been involved in politics for our entire career. So I think our children will answer that question differently one day. Schools, where you begin your day, begins with the Pledge of Allegiance. They're also important agents of political learning and the development of citizen orientations. The groups we belong to also foster basic values. Peer groups have influence on your social and political attitudes, as do individuals who live in the same neighborhoods. Something called the spiral of silence. This is the process by which a majority opinion becomes exaggerated because maybe a minority doesn't feel comfortable speaking out in opposition. So the minority often silences themselves in the face of majority consensus, which tends to embolden advocates of the majority opinion to speak even more confidently. Differences in public opinion. Political socialization produces citizenry that largely agrees with the rule of the game and accepts the outcome of national political process as legitimate. But this doesn't mean that our nation is in agreement on most or even very many things. As we get older and are exposed to more things, our opinions become more complex. Demographics, partisanship, ideology, education, economic self-interest, religion, where we live, these all affect the way we come to see politics and what we believe we have at stake in the political process. The kind of citizenship we practice, we move from consensus on the basics of American political culture to more divisive beliefs. And then what about race and ethnicity? Some of the most significant effect of the Obama presidency have been the opportunity for some Black kids to realize that the American dream of growing up to be the president actually belongs to them too. Race has been more divisive than unifying in this country, though. And only recently have Blacks achieved the same political rights as the white majority. And the disparity in income between whites and Blacks does continue. What about gender? For many years, gender had almost no predictive power in opinions and behaviors, except that women were maybe less active in politics and usually less warlike in their political attitudes. But since the 1960s, there's been a revolution. Women have gained more education and entered the workforce and increased their levels of participation in politics. In the last century, women's attitudes on issues diverged. There's something called the gender gap, which is the tendency of men and women to differ in their political views on some issues. This usually means that women are more liberal than men. And then there's something called the marriage gap, which is the tendency for married people to hold political opinions that differ from those people who have never married. Married people tend toward more traditional and conservative values. As people change their opinions as they age, experiences over time affects how we see the political world. There's little evidence that people progress from youthful idealism to mature conservatism, though. There's only small differences in policy preferences that are related to age, except for maybe in political engagement. Something called political generations. These are groups of citizens whose political views have been shaped by common events of their youth. So, for instance, growing up in the years after 9/11 gave a generation a set of values just as surely as having grown up during the Civil Rights Movement, World War II, the Great Depression. And then I'm sure the COVID generation will be considered one of these as well. As older groups die, overall opinion among the citizenry changes, which is a process called generational replacement. Much of the division in contemporary public opinion can be described as ideological, which is liberal or conservative, or partisan, Republican or Democratic terms. Party identification refers to our relatively enduring allegiances to one of the major political parties. Part of what defines us and comes from our very early years are party labels that provide mental cues that we use in interpreting and responding to personalities and news. It influences how we see the political world. Partisan sorting is the process through which citizens align themselves ideologically with one of the two parties, leaving fewer citizens remaining in the center and increasing polarization. The average Republican and Democrat are much farther apart ideologically than was the case in previous decades, which has had a profound impact on politics. A lot of people swing between candidates because there are not many people who come to elections with a fully open mind anymore, which makes it easier to demonize the opposition, contributing to nastiness, anger, and general incivility in contemporary politics. What about education? Separating citizen values into democratic enlightenment and democratic engagement. Democratic enlightenment refers to A citizen's ability to hold democratic beliefs, including the idea that politics is about compromise and sometimes the needs of the community will conflict with and override one's individual preferences. Democratic engagement refers to a citizen's ability to understand his or her own interests and how to pursue those interests in politics. Both of these are boosted by education. Better educated citizens are more likely to be informed about politics, to be tolerant, to be committed to democratic principles, and to vote and participate at all levels. And then economic self-interest. What's in it for me? Maybe those in the lowest income brackets are going to be the least likely to argue that too much is being spent on welfare or they're paying too much in taxes. Those with higher incomes are more likely to agree with those assessments. Religion. A lot of political issues touch on matters of deep moral conviction or values. The motivation for action or opinion is not self-interest, but maybe what's morally right. Many people argue that it's not up to the government to set moral standards. These questions are called social issues as opposed to economic issues, and they center on how to divide the economic pie. Where we live also matters, the geographic distinction. People in the Farm Belt talk about things differently than city dwellers in Manhattan. Politicians who come from these areas represent different things, and a lot of the politics in Congress is about being responsive to differing geographic-based opinions. How do we measure and track public opinion? Given the central role that public opinion plays in a democracy, finding out what the public thinks is really important, and one which social scientists have gotten very good at over the years, and sometimes discounted by politicians who don't like the results, but they're pretty accurate nowadays. What about learning about public opinion without polls? You know what your friends and family think about issues without conducting a formal poll. Simply talking to people gives you a sense of ideas and preferences, and most people are not shy about plastering their views on social media. Politicians are good talkers and good listeners. They learn constituent opinions from letters, phone calls, emails they receive, and then they visit and talk with leaders and representatives, pick up signals from crowds when they're speaking, and they use a mix of sources to learn about public opinion, personal contacts, but also polling data when running for office. For example, a sample, excuse me, a sample is the portion of the population selected to participate in a poll. Based on what the sample says, the surveyor then takes an estimate of what everyone else thinks. If the sample is scientifically chosen to be a representative of the whole population, this works well, and pollsters are trained to select a truly representative sample. Then there's something called sample bias, which is the effect of having a sample that doesn't represent all segments of a population. If a pollster selects too many people from one portion of the population, this can happen. Politicians must allow for the bias of their own sampling. If they're not effective at knowing how those they meet differ from full public opinion, they'll get a misleading idea of public opinion. The scientific poll we know today was developed in the 1930s, but newspapers and politicians have been trying to read public opinion as long as we've had democracies. Straw polls. These are polls that attempt to determine who is ahead in the political race, which were some of the first efforts at actually counting opinions. The name comes from the fact that straws, when thrown up in the air, will indicate which way the winds are blowing, which helps a politician predict which way the political winds are blowing and who will win an upcoming election. Today, polling is a big business and relatively precise. They all face the same two challenges, which are getting a good sample, entailing both the sampling of the right number of people and eliminating sample bias, and asking questions that yield valid results. How big does the sample need to be? No sample is perfect in matching the population from which it's drawn, but it should be close. Gallup said, okay, if you don't like the idea of a sample, the next time you go for a blood test, tell them to take it all. A poll's reliability is indicated by its sampling error, which is a number that indicates within what range of results a poll is politically accurate. Typically, we'll say it's within margin of error, which is plus or minus 3%. So based on sampling theory, there's 95% chance that the real figure for the whole population was within that 3% reported. The larger the sample, the smaller the sampling error to a certain point. Modern polls now employ a systematic random sample of the population whose opinions they want to describe. I don't think I'm ever going to get over this cold. Sorry. Random samples are samples chosen in a way that any member of the population being polled has an equal chance of being selected. And the chief form of sample bias in one of these is called a non-response bias, which is the skewing of data that occurs when there's a difference in opinion between those who choose to participate and those who do not. Sometimes in surveys, as few as 1/4 of those intended to be included actually participate. Pollsters deal with the problem of differential response rates, which yield a sample that doesn't look demographically like the population it's being sampled by weighting the sample to match what the census says the population actually looks like. Weighting is adjusting the surveys during analysis so the selected demographic groups reflect their values in the population, usually measured by the census. This is done during the analysis of the results. Over or underrepresented groups are multiplied by values that bring them into line with their actual numbers in the population. But new technologies have brought some challenges into polling. Technology is a pollster's friend for sure, but it can also create some unexpected challenges. Computers can do the telephone interviewing, robocalling, excuse me, which is much cheaper than using human interviewers, but it's controversial and easily abused. Computers also provide another challenge in the opportunity of what's called an online survey, which is where a pollster creates a panel of users who will regularly log in to deliver their opinions, but on the matters the pollsters select. They rely on strict probability samples, but they match fairly well with traditional telephone interviewing. An increased number of citizens rely on cell phones, and the U.S. Telephone Consumer Protection Act limits the technologies that can be used to contact cell phone users. They can't have auto dialing and things like that. So there's 3 main points with respect to conducting a survey question. Respondents should be asked about things they know and have thought about, including a don't know category, which lessens the chance that somebody's going to try to lie their way through a question they don't know anything about. The question should not be ambiguous. They should be a straightforward question. And similar questions can yield surprisingly different answers, depending on the wording. The order in which questions are asked can often change the results, as can such a simple factor as the number of choices offered for responses. Many people and organizations report that the results of what they claim are measures of public opinion. To make sense of this, it's useful to know that some basic polling terminology and the characteristics of these different types of polls. The efforts to measure public opinion within a limited period of time using a national representative as a sample can be used as well. The time period could be as short as a few hours with results reported the next day, or extended over a period of week, like an academic poll maybe. But the goal is going to be the same, to achieve a scientifically valued measure of the knowledge, beliefs, or attitudes of the population. Campaign polls. If you're going to run for office, you're going to probably start with what's called a benchmark poll, which is an initial poll on a candidate and its issues on which campaign strategy is based and against which later polls are compared. It's used to gather kind of a baseline on if the candidate's known, what people know about the candidate, how well they know them, what issues they're concerned about, what the assessment of the opposition, especially if the opponent is an incumbent, then it's used in designing a campaign strategy. Then you have something called a tracking poll, which is used a lot of times by a presidential candidate and some better funded statewide races. These are ongoing surveys that follow changes over time. They're ongoing sets of interviews. The daily samples are too small for reliable generalization, but when you average them over time, they become really helpful. A lot of times on election night, media commentators often call a race really early, declaring one candidate a winner, sometimes as soon as a voting booth has been closed. How do they do this? This is from something called an exit poll. These are election-related questions asked of voters right after they vote. Really quick questionnaires administered to a sample of voters right after they vote. They've had mixed records in recent years. It's difficult to obtain a full representative sample of the voters. Pseudo polls are a number of opinion studies that are wrongly presented as polls. Self-selection polls where you can kind of select yourself into a survey rather than be chosen randomly. This will only tell you about a portion of the media outlet's audience who cares enough to click a mouse, for example. You have to have access to a site, care enough to be on it, pause long enough to participate, which is going to be unrepresentative of the population as a whole. And there's something called a push poll. This is polls that ask for reactions to hypothetical, often false information in order to manipulate public opinion. They're used on a limited basis by pollster and campaign strategy to find out how voters might respond to negative information. So they're sometimes used as a form of propaganda, like planting a negative idea about a candidate, and usually conducted without any knowledge or acknowledgement of who's sponsoring them. There's been some legislation on them, and they're trying to decide if they can survive a First Amendment challenge before the Supreme Court. Polls conducted by social scientists are not so much to gauge and measure public opinion about elections, as to really figure out where people are on controversial issues and respondents. But people are not typically likely to disclose their true opinions, especially if it's controversial. So how accurate are polls? For many issues, attitudes toward the environment, presidential approval will have no objective measure against which to judge the accuracy of a public opinion poll. But election predictions, we can tell by the vote count whether or not the polls are correct. Almost all major polls have predicted the winner of the presidential elections correctly since 1980, except in the incredibly close 2000 election. They're not usually correct to the percentage points, though. But the polls, of course, closer to election day, typically become more accurate as they catch more of the late deciders. Politicians may act as though citizens are informed and attentive, though only some Americans live up to our model of the good citizenship, and those who do often belong disproportionately to the ranks of the well-educated, well-off, and older population. Were the founders right to limit the influence of the masses on the government? Do we want the less informed and less coherent opinions represented in politics? Can democracy survive if it's only run by an educated elite? It may not be rational for all people to be deeply immersed in the minutiae of day-to-day politics. We have families, jobs, hobbies, which leave a little time for in-depth study of political issues, unless you're me, and that is your family, job, and hobby. It might be rational for us to leave the political information gathering to others. So there's something called rational ignorance, which is the state of being uninformed about politics because of its time and cost, and the cost in time and energy. This doesn't mean we're ignorant. Citizens are usually pretty smart, and voters usually believe much more intelligently than we could ever guess from their answers to surveys about politics. But we use what's called a mental shortcut, the ability to receive and evaluate information as events happen, allowing us to remember our evaluation, even if we've forgotten the specific events that cause it. Many evaluations we make are on the fly, and we assemble impressions and reactions while we're leading our lives. The two-step flow of information is the process by which citizens take their political cues from more well-informed opinion leaders. We can only absorb a fraction of the mass amount of information set out by politicians and media, and even then, sometimes it's hard to interpret. So we usually rely on opinion leaders, the people we know who know more about certain topics than we do, and whose advice we trust and seek out and follow. If you're buying a car, you ask someone you know who drives it what they think about it. Sometimes you'll get an opinion from online, from social media, from blogs, from comments made by others. Technology allows us to ask a lot of other experts. The same thing happens politically. We can behave as though we're informed without requiring us to expend all the resources that being informed actually entails. All right, guys, thanks so much for hanging in there. Don't forget to take your third quiz and your second exam. And let me know if you have any questions about any of that or your essay prompt. I will be back on the week of the 21st with a lecture on political parties. So let me know if you have any questions. Thanks.